I'm Bryan DeLuca from Make It Build It.
And I'm Todd Saal from the Creative Mind Trip.
And this is Maker Everything. Today we got Kirsten McKenzie from Kreations to talk all about 3D modeling and some other really cool stuff. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming. So some of my questions and how I actually sort of found out about you is I actually found out what was funny is I found out about you on TikTok. I don't know if we just sort of like mutually follow each other or whatever the case was. And what's funny is a lot of some of like my subscribers and followers are like every time they see something they're like, did you see Kirsten's thing? I'm like, and it's hysterical. And I'm like, you mean, you know, or they'll say Kreations. And I'm like, do you mean Kirsten, right? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, okay. And they'll point out stuff and they'll be like, you should print this. It's really funny. I actually have, I know, it's great. I actually have a few messages probably in TikTok where people are like, hey, you should create this. And they send me your videos, which is really cool. That's why I was like, we got to have her on the podcast.
Super.
Yeah, and it's funny too because I was, working on a STEM project with my daughter, and she's like, "I want to do Flexi dogs." And it's funny, I was on Cult, and the first one that came up was yours, and I'm like, "I know her." To my daughter, I'm like, I'm talking to her tomorrow, so it was really funny.
That's awesome.
A lot of coincidences around it. So just so you know, you have a lot of fans out there that tell me on my channels.
It's so weird to me. Like I was live streaming. I live stream my sculpting sometimes, and I was live streaming a couple days ago, and someone came in. They're like, "Hey, what are you working on?" I was like, "I'm working on this and this," and then they followed me, and then it took them a second, and they came back, and they're like, "Wait, you're KE Kreations?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's me. You know me?"
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of people, it's funny because a lot of people point to your stuff. Like they'll sometimes send me links because, sometimes I'll just stream printing stuff and they'll be like, you should print this. And I'm like, yeah, it's nice to see. I'm always like, yes, that's Kirsten. Go follow her. It's the first thing I'll tell them when they come on, but it's awesome seeing that. So I'm going to start with the first question, right? So how did you get into sort of 3D modeling, right? I know you have some digital art background also. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
So I've basically done like 2D illustration since, basically for the past 10 years, freelancing stuff, and have always loved art. I've always loved fantasy and all that kind of stuff and creatures and animals. And I actually hurt my wrist in about 2017 overworking. And so took a break from art. And my husband has been into 3D printing for about 10 years, actually, like since college. And so he's always had like a 3D printer ever since we got married. And he started designing some of his own like little functional things around the house. Like, oh, I need this little part. I'm just going to make it, like figure it out, And so one day I was getting back into art after a couple of years and my wrist was better. I found different tools like the iPad that helps with my wrist. And on a whim, he had printed me, I think it was a MacGyver dragon.
Okay.
And I was like, because he knows I love dragons. And I was like, this is so cool. And on a whim, I was like, you know what? I was like, I want to make a dragon. And he was like, okay, great. And I was like, because, I see a lot of dragons that are so cool in the 3D printing world, but I don't see a lot that are like kind of my style, how I envision dragons, more with 4 legs and like more, my dragons are more like mammalian in anatomy.
Right.
Versus like the long snaky ones, right?
Yeah.
So cool, but different. And I was like, I don't see a dragon out there that's like how I imagine dragons, so I want to make one. And I asked my husband basically the technical side of like, okay, because he's much more mechanically brained than I am. I'm the artist and he's the engineer.
Right.
And so I was like, okay, so I want to make this. So how do I do this? And he kind of helped me parse out, okay, these are the links. These are how they work. With the 3D printing, it has to have the support from the build up. Otherwise, you're going to add supports. All that helped me learn all the technical knowledge and helped to get me start a little bit. And then I took, my base sculpts that we had made in Fusion 360, put them in the Nomad so I could add my scales and sculpting and everything on top of that. And took me probably like 2 or 3 months to finish my first Flexi dragon because I was very ambitious and very stubborn and really went into a very complex project for my first sculpt. But I finished it and I was like, oh, wow. I was like, this is awesome. It's so different with 2D art. You get to see your picture, but with the 3D art, getting to take that sculpt from digital and then like hold it and move it
Yeah.
And I was like, this is amazing. Like, this is so cool. It makes me so happy.
Uh-huh.
And with my art, like 2D art following at that point, you know, a lot of them had followed me for my fantasy art and stuff. And I had posted it out there and I was like, hey, like, does anybody want to buy these? Like, do y'all like these? And actually sold a good amount of those little dragons, like for the couple weeks. And then after a couple weeks, I was like, I hate shipping things out. I remember this about myself. I know this about myself in my art and career. And so I was like, I remember that I hate going to the post office. And my husband was like, you know, listen, he was like, I have a lot of like chronic health issues and things like that. So, you know, my energy is very limited in spaces. And so my husband being, you know, I tell people he's like the brains behind the operation. He's like, you know what? He's like, what you need to do. He's like, there are so many people out here that just do design work and sell those designs and then license out those designs to people who want to print and sell and go to conventions and stuff. He's like, that way you can just focus on the design work that you love and that you're so great at, and also conserve your energy and put your energy into what you love most, and let people who are, you know, great at doing the sales and want to go to those events and stuff, let them do that. And I was like, oh yeah, that's a pretty good idea. And so started then stockpiling, working on a few other designs, like a couple of my first fidgets and like smaller keychains and things like that, to get ready to go, okay, we're going to go full, we're going to sell design Patreon route, and also edited my dragon file because there were some things in there and I was like, this is not going to be easy to print for everybody, and so I need to make this mass printable. Basically, we need to change some things. And so that's kind of how we got started. It's all thanks to my husband, you know, with his mechanical brain and 3D printing background paired with my artistic brain. It kind of helped make the perfect combo.
Todd and I joke around about that.
Yep. Without a doubt
about that.
Yeah, I'm sort of his husband in that.
Yeah. So,
but I always tell people, I'm like, you know, my dad's an engineer, so I was raised by engineers and I married an engineer. I really fit in and feel much more at home in like the engineer kind of space than with other artists. So 3D printing is a great place for me.
Well, let me tell you something, because I have like a very technical, like engineering sort of background, right? And that's, you know, and it's like the perfect blend, you know, coming from a technical background, especially into 3D printing. That's a little bit more of a technical art, and even the sculpting part, like designing, having that technical aspect is huge, you know, in that. Now, I have a question. I'm gonna back up to dragons because I'm a fantasy person too. So I always ask the question, right? So you're right. All those Flexi dragons are like sort of like, you know, like Asian dragons, right? The little tiny legs, and then you got the. Like, I'm gonna point back there. You got the you sort of got like the dragons, like the fantasy dragons, like the. Are you guys like D&D geeks like I am, or? So
this is funny. Everybody asks me that, and like I love and admire D&D, but I don't play. I've played a couple of top role play games, and I'm like, just don't get into them. I like written role play and stuff. Right. Sometimes, like, I like writing fantasy stuff, but like my whole brand, I'm very aware that it's like very D&D adjacent.
Right. Yeah. It is. Well, you have dice towers, right? Yeah.
I love looking at the art and everything, but it's like I don't play, so it's a funny scenario.
I've played for probably longer than I could imagine, but I actually enjoy the art and the like miniature aspect of it better than I actually do enjoy the game. So I'm very similar to the way you are with it. Like I enjoy the whole mythology and the mythos behind like all of it, you know. But I had to back up because when you mentioned sort of like the fantasy dragons, right? So it was a question, you know. So you also mentioned going from Fusion 360, right, which is a little more technical. I'm assuming maybe that's probably what your husband was using, engineering stuff, right? Going into Nomad Sculpt and going into sort of like this detail. So how was that transition?
So that was an interesting learning curve. And for me, the digital sculpting as a 2D artist background, much more intuitive. I, you know, jumped into Nomad and I was like, okay, they're great. Fusion it still kind of hurts my brain sometimes. Every once in a while, if I want something more mechanically complex, I'll work on it a little bit, and then I'll finally ask my husband, I'm like, can you make this thing? Because like your brain just works so much better on this, and he'll whip it up in Fusion in like 5 minutes. Right. You know, he's been working in Fusion for a long time, especially with work and different things too. And so, but figuring out how to take the Fusion file and then get it to work properly in Nomad was definitely a learning curve, because I have learned that you cannot go from Nomad to Fusion, and it just doesn't work. It will crash the program.
So what made you go to Nomad in the first place?
Also, my husband, I said he takes credit for everything, because he worked in virtual reality for a while, and one of the companies he worked with, and one of the sculptors, digital sculptors on their team in the virtual reality team was like, oh, had some little like 3D sculpting lessons or whatever that she would teach the team. And she was like, Nomad Sculpt is great. It's only like $15 on the iPad, super easy, very beginner friendly. And so he kind of like played with it for a second with her little lessons, and then kind of didn't think about it that much, because again, he's much more intuitive with the Fusion 360 mechanical way.
That's how I came about and found you, is through trying to understand Nomad, because I mainly did Blender, but I was like, I need something more simple, and that's how I found you. And
exactly, yep. And so he didn't really touch Nomad again, but then when I started getting into it, he was like, hey, you should just download this program that, the girl from work had suggested that she uses for her sculpts. And I was like, okay, great. I had actually tried Blender like once upon a time, like years and years ago, on my desktop computer, and I hated it. And I was like, I'm never doing 3D sculpting again.
Yeah.
And that's probably important for like people to understand too. It's like the point of entry for learning how to digitally sculpt and then go down the road that you went down. Nomad it's a great tool.
It's amazing.
Right?
Yeah, and like people will come into my streams all the time while I'm working on sculpts and stuff, and they're like, what's a good beginner friendly program? I'm like, what I'm working on right now is what I learned on, and also it has done everything that I've needed it to do for all of my stuff.
And I feel like too, when you're creative, sometimes it's really hard, like with Blender. Let's just back up to Blender for a second. I can't remember 87 million shortcut keys that I got to remember. Like, I just want to click on stuff or touch stuff, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, to do what I want to do. And for me, like, sometimes I'm like, oh man, what do I got to hit? Control what? And then I'm like, and I'm Googling like what I got to hit in the middle of like making something sometimes.
Yeah, and it's like ruining your workflow. But yeah, going back to your question about like working with Fusion together with Nomad, I got a little sidetracked, so basically if we make a base in Fusion, something really simple mechanical that I can work and sculpt on top of, I'll export that as an OBJ. And then I work between my desktop and my iPad. I use like Google Drive for everything.
Right.
So I'll Google Drive that, open it up in my iPad, and I can import that from there straight into Nomad as a new project. The thing that I figured out is because Fusion basically works with as few triangles as possible to get the shape that you want, which means when you then import it into Nomad, if you try to sculpt directly on top of that immediately, you're going to have like all these weird jaggedy triangles that are just trying to warp out of place, right? So what I figured out is you pull it in there, and then you have to remesh the whole thing, which is a simple, simple operation in Nomad. I usually will remesh up to like from a Fusion file into like 4 to 500 resolution. And I usually will maintain all of that detail and those smooth lines that the Fusion file gave me, but then I can actually go in and sculpt on top of that.
Gotcha.
And then I can add other shapes onto that base mechanic that I have. Another operation that's super helpful when I'm working on those Fusion files is when you go into your brush settings on Nomad, you have a brush setting that says it's like affect only the front-facing vertices, which means if you paint over, it's not going to affect that inside space. And so that's really helpful if I'm working on something mechanical from Fusion that has a part that works together, and I want to sculpt on the outside of it, but I don't want it to change and mess up what I have going on in here.
That's cool.
Okay.
Because a lot of the brushes, especially depending on if you have thinner walls, when you sculpt in here, it also affects the geometry on the inside.
Right.
But if you click on that little box on your brush settings that only affect the vertexes and the front where you're facing, then it's only going to affect that outward space that you're actually touching. Just super helpful. So that's kind of how I meld the two together. And then, like I said, you can't go from Nomad into Fusion because, again, Fusion wants to work with as little triangles as possible. In Nomad, to have all that smoothness and detail, you're working with lots of triangles. And so they just Fusion doesn't like that when you do that with try to pull a Nomad file with like 300K triangles into Fusion. Fusion's like, we don't do this.
Yep.
So I have a question. So when you're designing a Flexi, right? Let's talk a little bit about the design of Flexis. Do you make the joints in Fusion, like your
Yep.
joints? Okay.
At this point, I do. That very first one that I made that my husband was helping me with, we made the joint structure in Fusion.
Right.
And then I imported it into Nomad and did my sculpting and everything. At this point, because I love Fusion, I love Nomad so much more than Fusion 360. It's so much more intuitive for me.
Mm-hmm.
I figured out how to pretty quickly and easily do pretty much all of my Flexi joints in Nomad Sculpt directly.
Gotcha.
Those donuts and then sculpting and shaping those donuts around each other and shrouding the body and learning how to cut pieces like shapes out of other shapes was super helpful with doing my different joints and getting those tolerances right. So I pretty much my whole 95+% of my workflow is just in Nomad Sculpt at this point.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
That is cool.
Now, have you messed it besides like the chain joints? Have you messed with other like ball and socket joints in your models or any of those other types of joints?
I play around with a lot of different things. Let me think. Who do I have around here? That is easy. So here's my wolf. So he has.
You got a hinge joint.
He has a ball socket on this wheel, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So he prints with it positioned like that, but then allows it to lay flat down like that. And then his feet are more of these hinge joints.
Yep.
And the legs are a hinge joint as well, but you see that bar in between there?
Mm-hmm.
So that hinges between both of them, but then at the elbow they can move separate.
Awesome.
That's
and
neat.
then he has the regular, chain joint throughout his whole body here. And I've played around with, where did they go? I don't have them on hand right now. I just recently have gotten more into snapping assembly joints. Been getting a little bit more daring with a little more experimental with those. And a fairy that I just released recently, she has some body parts that snap in together. Some of those, like a shoulder joint, my husband helped me design because I was like, I need this movement. I need it to be easy to assemble, easy to print. Like, how do I do this? And I need to be sturdy and be able to scale it up and down.
That's great that you have like that other resource too. When you run into an issue, that's really cool.
Exactly. It's like I said, it's like the perfect like combo of both.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. You're gonna start getting messages. People are gonna be like, "Hey, can your husband design this joint for me?"
Discord. I have a Discord server for my Patreon members and stuff, right? And I'll like talk about my husband on his online name, his Kirbest.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, Kirbest did this, or he helped me with this, and like, he's so great. And everybody in my Discord's like, where do I get a Kirbest? I'm like, dude,
I want one. I want one.
Right? Everybody wants one.
Oh, that's awesome.
That is funny.
That's awesome. So you talked a little bit about the evolution of your Flexis, right? First you started out with like simple dragons, then you showed us the wolf, which is now incorporating hinge joints. You talked about some of the snap joints. Where do you see it going? Like how far do you see like sort of like almost like toy making or Flexis going with 3D printing?
I think there's so many possibilities, and especially as you kind of want it, you have more limitations with the print in place setups, right? But then once you start getting into more, add a little bit of simple assembly, you open up a whole world of different possibilities, right? That's kind of where my brain is at in this particular moment, where I'm like, oh, like I've just done the print in place. Okay, how do I make this like this? I need to be positioned like this, because I also like to make my stuff support free, because I personally hate support. So I don't want to I don't want to design anything that I don't want to personally print.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, that all has to work and flow in a particular way for it to print properly. But then once you start getting into, well, some assembly, as long as it's easy, is not bad, then you have so many other possibilities of different, more dynamic movement and like different looks and stuff too. With my fairy doll that I had just released recently, I was originally designing her to be all print in place.
Right.
With that, some of the like joint sockets and stuff, they were just a little bit off, like a little bit not quite balanced, because they had to print in place, they had to move a certain way. And again, my husband was the one that he was looking at, and he was like, you know what? He was like, I think if you would be willing to, dare into a little bit of assembly, he's like, I think you can make this look much cleaner and like much better and still make it easy for people to print and assemble.
Right. Yeah.
And so then he hopped on and helped me with that. And it's so fun then, you can make things that are bigger and then assemble them together. That doesn't all have to fit on the build plate. You can get a lot more dynamic movement, realistic movement with your flexis and dolls and stuff like that, which is so fun.
Well, and I think what's nice about that, like the assembly stuff, you wind up with not so much like a flat back on the back of the doll, right? Or whatever the case is, because they, some of them you're like, oh, this looks so cool. And then you sort of turn it around. You're like, well, it's missing its whole, like two-thirds of what it actually is, because it's, it had to be print in place.
Exactly.
Now, what about, so you see this more and more, right? Pre-colored prints coming, especially with, AMS systems.
Yeah.
So how has that become important in terms of like your designing? Like, when you send these, when you put these out on your Patreon, they're pre-colored, things like that, correct? And that seems to be, because for a lot of us, no one wants, for me, I'm going to say like, like I was painting a spider for my daughter. I'm like, oh, I got to make sure it's getting like right in the socket, and I don't necessarily, on certain things, you don't want to spend the time doing it. Certain things you do. But how important has that become also? Like painting?
That has been a really surprising but fun addition to my workflow. At first, I didn't do multicolor models that much, even though I had the AMS system pretty early on. But I was like, I don't know if I want to hassle with it. I don't know if other people want to hassle with it. Multicolor prints take so long. But then I started doing them and I was like, oh, like they look so good. Like they're so fun. And so that has actually become like a really relaxing part of my process, because it kind of takes me back to my 2D art foundation, right? Of just like the drawing and coloring. And I do half and half of my coloring on the desktop computer, and also have my desktop linked up to my iPad so I can use my iPad as a drawing tablet, again, to help my wrist with all these things and get those little details. And so it has become a pretty smooth part of my workflow at this point. I am really bad at like multicolor painting is the last thing I will do in my model creation. Like right now, I'm printing a multicolor model right now that is releasing in 2 days. And it has been tested and finalized and tested for like a month, but I just haven't gotten a multicolor print done. I painted him last night, and then now it's going to the printer. And so for me, it's been a little bit of a last minute, but I've gotten to the point, there is a learning curve with the Bamboo Studio.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because like you said, like, oh, like how do I get into these creases? Like how do I move this around? How is my sphere brush going to interact differently than just the circle, or where does the bucket fill, and how does all those things work? And so it's definitely taken some learning to get used to all those tools, but I would say at this point it's a pretty smooth process, especially with the help of having the iPad for all those little details that I need. And then also learning, with Nomad sculpting, most of my animals are very organic sculpts. They're not a lot of individual shapes.
Right.
But every once in a while I have, a sculpt that I export. Like the eyes are typically pretty easy to color because those are separate objects. They're spheres, right? And so that's also learning to work with Nomad Sculpt of, okay, I can join these objects, and then when I import them into Bamboo is able to see and separate those objects still. And I can see, okay, the ears are separate, the eyes are separate, this foot is separate, things like that. But in Nomad, if I do, like you've played around in Nomad a little bit, like people who don't, if you would go into and you voxel merge all of those points, basically that redistributes the entire mesh of that object and totally merges it into one object.
Yep. And then when you select it in Bamboo Studio,
separate it out into parts later. And also Bamboo Studio is going to have a much harder time recognizing those different parts.
Yeah. So do you paint? Because I know some people, and I haven't done this yet, but they paint separately in like Nomad Sculpt, and then they import that as a certain type of file into Bamboo Studios. I saw something on that. I haven't really messed with it, where they could keep some of the coloration.
I played with that actually like a week or two ago because people were asking me. They're like, you work in Nomad Bamboo, just push this update.
Right.
But we'll keep those colors in there. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to update Bamboo Studio basically just so I can test this out and see what this is about because people are asking me. And so I tested it out, and the problem that I found is it was much harder to get the colors done in Nomad to look as smooth as they do in Bamboo Studio when you color them straight in there.
Gotcha.
Because basically with Nomad, you're coloring, and it's, again, all of those triangles are affecting the colors that you're putting down. And, when you paint in Nomad, that paintbrush can only affect those triangles, And so then basically what you have to do to get that painting to look really smooth is you have to subdivide that item, which means like multiply those triangles over and over again to get it so those triangles are really, really little. And then you can get a really smooth painting effect. But then by that point, that's a larger file than I want to export and push into Bamboo Studio because it's going to bog down your process, right? And so I would have to subdivide it way larger than I would normally would, paint it, decimate it back, which means like, spread out those triangles again so there's fewer, and then import it into Bamboo and hope that everything works perfectly.
Right.
And because also I do some of my post-processing in Bamboo Studio itself, actually. And so like if I import a file into Nomad and there's something that's not quite flat, I want to slice off that bottom, make sure it prints perfectly flat. So, you got to subdivide your model a whole ton to get it to paint smoothly in Nomad for the first place. And then you got to decimate it down to where you can import it into Bamboo Studio without it bogging down your computer and all that. But part of my problem with my personal workflow is I'll import my model into Bamboo Studio with kind of an estimate of where everything is going to slice off on the bottom.
Right.
And I'll actually do that final slice off the bottom to make it flat, to make it print flat. Well, I'll do that in Bamboo Studio. That way, or just for my own brain, you can slice it off in Nomad, but for my own brain, I get more peace of mind knowing that I don't have an angle off or anything weird. I can just slice it directly in Bamboo and know that it's going to be perfect. And then, so if you do that, or if you simplify a model, if I accidentally have more triangles in there than I wanted, and it's like, hey, you have over 1 million triangles. I'm like, okay, I want to simplify this a little bit. Or if I have any non-manifold edges, which sometimes happens, if I want to fix those, if I want to simplify a model, and if I want to cut into my model at all of those actions are going to completely erase my painting anyway.
Gotcha.
Then it's like, well, what's the point of doing it in Nomad, right? Then if you're going to go in here, and I would have to, export from Nomad into Bamboo for my personal process, do all those little finishing steps that I do, put it back into Nomad, paint it, and then put it back into Bamboo.
And then hope it was still okay.
Weird in between because, sometimes my brain does weird things and I don't realize. And so for me, especially since I have the tools and the app and thing to help connect my iPad to my computer to use my pen tablet, it's just so much easier and fluid in my workflow to do straight on Bamboo. That last finishing step is my coloring. Everything in the model is tested. It's good. It's solid. Needs no edits. Then we're going to go in there and color it. That just works better for me rather than going back and forth because I think I would confuse myself and do something wrong in between those processes.
So if somebody came to you and said, okay, I want to do some of the things that you do, like how would you kind of tell them like what approach to sort of take? Because I mean, you've had so much other help too, like a lot of us do.
Absolutely.
But it's like that starting point. How would you kind of tell somebody to how they could get started without getting
kind of for
overwhelmed?
Right?
Yeah, and not get them so overwhelmed that they get discouraged and not wanting to do because this stuff is cool.
Yeah, I always start with what type of things. Even like before you get into the technical side, think about what you want to make and be like, what do you enjoy, what makes you happy,
Mhm.
and like what do you want to make for yourself first, right? And so that'll help your motivation of like, okay, I want to get this thing that I love. And so then, you know, being like, okay, I want to make this. Say you go into Nomad Sculpt. Say you have some 3D printing experience, like, you know, okay, I know how supports work, how non-supports work, things like that. And then you can go into Nomad Sculpt and, you know, get your sphere and just start. I always, you know, I have a lot of tutorials on my own YouTube channel of how kind of some of the basics of Nomad Sculpt. And like you said, there's so many things to get into. I'm like, part of my problem is I'm like, I don't know which ones I need to talk about for people.
Yeah, I mean, the rabbit hole goes very deep, and it's, you know, you find yourself going in too many different directions and not really achieving the things that you want.
I always recommend people, you know, open up Nomad Sculpt first. Make sure that you turn on and understand your symmetry setting, which I have a video on that, because that is super important for my workflow to keep everything, you know, functional and proportional and looking good in place. Make sure that you have that on and you understand how that works. And then really just, you have your set of brushes and tools over here, right? Anytime I'm working with any new digital art program, whether it's sculpting, you know, Clip Studio Paint, Photoshop, Illustrator, anything like that, I'm just going to go like spend a day doing a whole sweep through all the tools and just playing with them and just kind of getting familiar with how do they even work. And that's what I always suggest for people. I'm like, honestly, I can't necessarily teach you how to understand how this tool feels different than this tool. But take the tool, play around with it, play around with your brush settings, and just move the clay around, see how the different tools affect different things. And then you can start to say, okay, now, you know, I have a sphere. Let me, with my gizmo tool, let me elongate it out and then like warp it this way. You can start with a base this way. And then let me add another sphere on top of that, and learning how to pull that clay and just play with it and meld it. And again, giving that symmetry helps a lot. And again, having like a image in your brain for like what your end result you want to be helps. And you can add reference images in Nomad Sculpt actually to sit in the background.
Right.
Like last Christmas, I actually helped my niece and nephew who are 7 and 9 sculpt Christmas gifts that they wanted to sculpt for each other, and then printed and helped them paint. And so, you know, we sat there and I was like, you know, they're really sharp, awesome kids. I was like, you're going to figure this out. And I was like, so these are how all the tools work. And, you know, you look at your picture, like here's your reference image that you're trying to copy and duplicate. And then, you know, they were really awesome about, okay, you know, I want this to look like this. This is my reference picture. And then they would be like, okay, so how do you do this? Or how do I get my model to do this? How does the clay do this? And I'll be like, okay, this tool can do this. You know, like the crease tool is really good for like putting in those really little details or things like that.
Right.
And then they'd be like, okay, awesome. And then they take the tool and work on it themselves and try and get the feel for that, right? And I was like, they're like, if I want to add this ear like that, like what shape would you add? Like I'd probably add this shape and then kind of warp it with this tool. You know, so really it's about, you know, before you even need to worry about actual tutorials, just like play around with the tools that you can see, you know, adding in different shapes and seeing what you can do with those different shapes, playing with all of your tools, you know, your drag, your pull, your brush, and seeing how those different things affect your clay. And like, oh, okay, so, you know, I can warp it this way, and get a little bit closer to my end result, even if you don't have, you know, all of the details, you know, just trying to get the feel for that.
So it was funny when I was first showing. Actually, it was funny. I was teaching my daughter. She was using Nomad Sculpt for the first time when we were on a plane ride, and she was designing a cat, right?
Yeah.
Which is, you know, what she's into, these cats. But it was funny because she could see the cat from the one dimension, but as soon as she rotated, she didn't realize like three-dimensionally, like, you know, structurally you need to.
That was one thing that my niece and nephew too. They were like, okay, it looks good here, and I was like, okay, but they were getting it near the end of the project. I was like, remember, you always need to be rotating your canvas around, and make sure that you have it looking good from different angles. And even you can find reference pictures, if you need to, of like, if you want a cat, even for me, if I'm making a new Flexi or something like that, I'm going to find a picture of, a cat face from front, and I'm going to find it from the profile view. So I can make sure, okay, we're going to work on the front, but then I need to make sure the side looks good because this is going to be all 3D.
Yep.
And so that's so important to remember. That's not intuitive in our brains, even if, everybody kind of sketches and draws growing up a little bit, right? Even if you're not super artistic, you've doodled. And so that's, we're like, oh yeah, it looks good from this face.
From this angle.
Right. But you have to remember, okay, constantly be rotating your canvas. How does it look over here? How does it look over here? And find more reference images if you need to help you have a better idea. Because sometimes you're like, oh yeah, I know what a cat looks like.
Right.
But then you're like, but do I know what a cat looks like? Like from this angle too,
Yeah.
Well, I mean, do you find that your experience with like 2D art has definitely helped your 3D art, or you had to readjust how you're thinking and when you got more deeper into it?
I think it definitely helps, because I think it was definitely a little bit of a brain switch for me going from 2D to 3D and being like, okay, I need to figure out how to make this move and, working on all those different angles. But I think it definitely helped me understand, there's a learning curve with learning. It's a different medium, right? And, in my experience with art, I've done a little bit of clay sculpting, I've done watercolor, I've done pencils, markers, digital, like touched into animation, like a lot of different things. And so it's just a new medium, right? There's always going to be that learning curve.
Right.
And then the 3D is just a little bit extra of like, okay, like, shape language and like design structure and like an anatomy structure, and all those are the same within 2D to 3D, right? And so, but then it's learning, okay, now I need to figure out how to make this translate and move my clay and move my things in a way that's different than sketching. Like I was working on a new dice tower a couple nights ago in stream actually, and for some reason, like my brain was just not figuring out how these wings that I was working on needed to work. And I had my reference images up, and I was like, you know what? I was like, I need to go and sketch this in like 2D. So I went on my iPad, pulled up Procreate, and for me, it's just little scribbles. It doesn't look like anything to people. But I'm like, okay, but I need to just help myself envision clearly these wings need to move like this from this side, and they're going to look like this at this angle too. So then being able to sketch that out and get it out of my brain then helps me understand for the 3D aspect of like, oh, okay, yeah, this is how this is going to translate and how this is actually going to look, versus because, I'm looking at pictures of bird wings and none of those wings are in like the exact pose that I
right, exactly.
Because I'm doing a dice tower. So, and I understand the anatomy, which has been, over a decade of working specifically with like animal portraiture, animal art, fantasy art. So understanding that base concept of anatomy and proportion, the shape language helps. But then sometimes I need that. It takes some time to figure out, okay, I can sketch this out real quick, but how does this need to work in 3D? And so there's always a little bit, I'm always learning new things still.
I think it's
I definitely think that 2D background helped me, again, just because there's a lot of concepts that are going to be the same no matter what art form you're doing, you know. But I definitely think that even if you don't have a background in art, or like 2D art or anything like that, you can pick up Nomad just the same as anybody else, and you may need to work on like some of the refining things, like little details and like things like that. Anatomy may need a little bit more work than like someone like me who understands that already. But anybody can pick it up and sculpt and create awesome things, with using their reference images. And okay, like I can add this ball and this shape and this ball for this ear or this face and eyes and things like that, especially if you have a little bit of help tutorials and things like that to be like, how do I do this? Okay.
Yeah. And there's so much info out there now too. So
it's so great.
So when did you decide, right? At some point you started selling your models online, right? When did you go, I have enough of a library of, files to go and sort of create a Patreon? How was that experience for you?
Honestly, I didn't have a huge stockpile before I started my Patreon.
Okay.
And I've changed my tiers and how I function with my Patreon a couple times as my brand has evolved and things. And so I think I had designed, and then I had testers. Like, I went and found my other digital art friends, and I was like, do any of you have 3D printers? And they were like, oh, my husband has a 3D printer. I'm like, can I send you this for free and test it and make me know that it actually works? Because it doesn't matter if it works on my printer. I need it to work on y'all's printers.
Yeah.
And especially because at this point we were working with the Prusa, which my husband had fine-tuned for 7 years.
Yeah.
You know, which is not going to be everybody's machine.
Yeah. I have an ender like that around here.
And so it was, I think I had about 5 files that I had tested, had gotten other people outside of our household to test for me and make sure they work, and added some little tweaks here and there as needed. And that's what I launched my Patreon with, was like those 5 files.
Okay.
And that was also knowing me. My workflow is very fast. And so that's me putting out 5 and knowing at that point in time, feeling confident that it was not going to take me 3 months to get another 5 out. You know, I can put out 5 and I can put out another 5 next month for those people. You know, that's kind of always been something that I noticed even with my 2D art, is that my workflow is just very efficient for some reason. I didn't realize that. And so I can, you know, once I was comfortable with the tools and figuring out the mechanics and things like that, I felt comfortable that I could, like, okay, I'm going to launch with not a ton, but I know I can keep putting out more. And then the first few months of my Patreon, I actually had it open to where when you joined, you got all the files that I had created. Where now I have, you know, over 150 models out there. So now it's limited. You know, you don't get everything. You just get a pretty bulky welcome pack and things like that. But, you know, at that point, I was like, you know, I don't have that much. So if you join, you get everything that I have. You know, and so then I think it was about when I had like around 50 models or so. Then I was like, okay, now I want to start. You don't get everything, because then you have people that, you know, because it's what's the word? Because it's financially efficient, right? They'll come on, you know, they can come on every 6 months, come get 50 files, and then like, okay, I'll be back in another 6 months for another 50 that you put out, right?
Instead of the content support.
You know, I don't blame them. That's what, you know, you want to be budget conscious, but also for me, I want to make sure that me and my other Patreon members are getting value for what I'm putting out.
Absolutely. And you know, and anyone, if you're doing hard work, you know, you deserve to be rewarded, right, for that hard work. You know, that's just, and that's any job, right? You know, so right. So
do you find that your headspace has to switch when you're kind of creative mode versus business mode, and how do you kind of merge those two?
I think for me, because I've been in like the art freelance industry for so long, just kind of doing business as myself in my art, I think for me it's not too difficult.
Okay.
Because I've just done it for so long, it's a little more intuitive, right? But it was definitely still, there's sometimes that I'm like, hey, again, I'll ask my husband, because he has worked in marketing and things. I'm like, what about this? Or like, this sounds nice, but like, is this a good business decision? Or he's like, you're putting out so many files, but you need to like slow down, or you need to like break things up in your tiers so that you distribute them more clearly for people and things like that. And so that those kind of things,
balance, right?
Yeah. So those kind of things, he's super helpful. But as far as like, you know, like marketing and like social media and like, you know, oh, I need to go write my Patreon post, I need to upload all these files, all of that, I think I really enjoy. Actually, it's pretty, you know, I would say uploading new files is like the most boring thing on my list of to-dos. But, you know, doing the social media posts, you know, interacting with my community, I really enjoy. And I think it has helped, again, having that freelance entrepreneur 2D background of just, you know, I think all artists, all of us struggle with this business, like marketing sales aspect. It's not intuitive for us. A lot of artists are introverts. And so, but just learning over years and years of, okay, I'm not going to be getting commissions. I'm not going to make sales. I'm not going to do this if I don't really put it all out there, and if I don't touch and interact with every person who wants my content, right? And so I think that over the past, decade has just helped train me to where it's pretty intuitive, but it's definitely something that I understand is not always the easiest. So like, how do I do this? How do I do this? And, I was talking to my sister about marketing for her training. My sister also trains dogs. That's part of how I had gotten into that for a part of it. And she was talking to me. She was like, how do I do like this marketing, or how do I grow like a larger platform online? And I was like, you got to do this. You got to do this. You got to do this. You got to do these videos. You got to post on these platforms. And she was like, that's so much. I don't want to do that much. And I was like, I know.
Yeah. We joke around about this all the time. Like, being a content creator, editing your videos like takes so long. Like, people don't realize like how long it takes to create your videos. It's like, I'm like, okay, right after this, I got to film X, Y, and Z to produce this, this part. So it's pretty crazy. Well, Kirsten, it was great talking to you. Tell everyone where else they could find more about you.
Awesome. So the place that you found me was TikTok. So I'm, like I said, all over the internet with my art and my 3D art now. But Patreon is where you can get a good bulk of my models, and commercial licensing if you want to print and sell those models. I now have Patreon. I'm on Fangs as well with their membership process, and I'm on Tribes on my mini factory. All three of those, you get the exact same welcome pack, exact same rewards. It just depends on what platform you prefer. And they all have the same tier setups to where you can, pick and choose if you just want the decor stuff, if you just want Flexi stuff, or if you want all the things that I put out. You can choose those tiers, and then you get those files that I put out every month, and you get commercial licensing if you want to then go to those events and things, or sell online, sell on TikTok Shop, things like that. And then I'm basically everywhere. I am KE Kreations Art, this, with the KE and then K Kreations Art. I'm on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, X now, I guess. I'm on Threads. Like I said, I'm pretty much everywhere on that same name.
You also have a website, right?
And YouTube. I'm also on YouTube it's just KE Kreations on YouTube. That's where I post all of my longer form tutorials, and some of my like live stream recaps I'll post on there as well.
And you also have a website, right?
Yes, and my website desperately needs a revamp.
Right. We won't share it.
My 2D art, but my website is also just kecreationsart.com, and I do have links on there to my Patreon and stuff. But if you want to see my 2D art and things like that, you can also see a lot of that there. But it does desperately need a revamp. Cool. But you can get to a lot of my links through there as well.
Well, thank you for joining us today. It was great talking with you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.